and good morning. This is Robert Romej, and we've got Brian Hook and Makenna Ayres. Thanks for being here today, everyone.
Good to see you guys.
Yes.
Did you have a good Easter?
Had a great Easter.
Such a
That's
good
awesome.
Easter.
Yes. It was such a good weekend. I think from Good Friday, we had a little service to
Yeah.
Easter. It was super fun.
Yeah.
Spending
Had
a
a
lot of time
great
with people.
Sunday too, huh?
It was.
Big
We had a lot
time.
of visitors, which was really cool.
Packed.
Saw some people come to know Christ.
Packed the NPR.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
Absolutely. That little elementary gym was fully packed.
I'm still a little tired. I'm still a little tired.
Yeah.
It's like I've never been drunk, so I don't know what a hangover feels like. But I've done Easter, and it feels
You
like
think it's pretty
an
close?
Easter. It's an Easter hangover. A little
That's a
tired.
good way to put it.
Yeah.
That sounds like a church planner. It's like you, everyone else is kind of, maybe gone and they're now having lunch and you're still probably doing stuff.
I was still unloading the truck. Still unloading. It's Tuesday.
Oh, man.
I still have things in the back of the truck from Easter.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, maybe after this we can go and help you with that.
Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great.
Well, the last couple of podcasts, we talked a little bit about making disciples. We talked a little bit about domains. And so this is, if you haven't listened to those, go back and listen to those episodes because it will be really helpful for what we're going to talk about today. So we started touching on the Great Commission, going and making disciples. And with that, we talked a little bit about multiplication. But I think today, let's go ahead and press into that a little bit more. And so let's just kick it off with the question of realizing that some churches view multiplication as optional, right? Like if a church is planting other churches, good for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to. Other churches view that as the goal. Like that is what, or maybe not the goal, that's the sign of health.
Sure.
If we're healthy, we're multiplying and making more churches. So let's just start there. Is there a solid, in Scripture, do we see something that tells us that we should be doing this? We should be multiplying churches.
Yeah, I think there is. I think that, we talked earlier about the eternal purpose of God, and the eternal purpose kind of has this idea that it continues on, right? So there's this continued flow of the church and seeing Christ-centered community. And so multiplying that is really in our DNA, to multiply, because the mission's is important. The mission of God is within us. So to multiply that out is huge. And I think there's some basic biblical mandates for it. I look at our name, Aspire, and that name actually is from Romans 15:20. And Paul is speaking about, I aspire to preach the gospel, not where Christ was already known by name, so that I would not build on another man's foundation. And when you look at that passage, he's speaking about church planting. He's not just talking about the proclamation of Jesus to see more people come to know Jesus, to bring them back to a worship service. He's saying, I want to continue on to go tell others and not build on another man's foundation. So sometimes we like to build on our own foundation. We like to do that. We like to get, who doesn't want more people, right?
Right.
And who doesn't want more aspects of, in our humanity, control too?
Yeah.
Like it's like, these are my people, and these are the people that, and I think in a very positive way, we do believe in what we're doing. So we don't want people to go somewhere else where it doesn't necessarily line up with what we believe in our core values. And so to have more people and all that, I think humanly speaking, it makes sense to say, church planting just kind of gets in the way of our mission. Our quality management and what we believe and so some churches will take more of a castle mentality, and I'm using Jeff Christopherson's term. He used that, you're either kingdom or you're castle building. Like are you building the kingdom, which we are all called to do, or are you just building your own castle, kind of, having a moat and all that. And boy, it would be a great idea to just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and not planting. But here's the problem. It's not biblical. So because it's not biblical, I think that's why we planted. I think you have to come back to biblical. Like, is it right to do it? Yes, it is. And sometimes people say, to plant churches, that's the best way to effectively see people come to know Christ, because in the first 2 to 3 years, you see
Right.
so many people come to know Christ, which is true.
Yep.
And I would say that's one reason why you should. But I think before that, you really do it because it's biblical, you know. And I think some guys just, they look at it as optional,
Sure.
and it's not optional.
How would you help someone to understand that when Paul's talking about that in Romans, that it isn't just preaching the gospel, but it's actually building a foundation, and the foundation being a church? How would you kind of help someone get there if they're maybe reading that and haven't really heard it that way? Any thoughts
That's a
on
good
that?
question.
Well, I think, you know, in a city, there are so many different people and so many different communities, so many different cultures. We like to be multicultural. Our church is. As much as you can be. We're predominantly in the foothills, which is predominantly white, you know, upper class white. But we have a church that is multicultural.
Very
And it's
multicultural,
it's-
especially for its size.
Yeah, it's
Very
I think,
multicultural.
Yeah, and it's awesome to see people that drive there. But the reality is too, there are different cultures in our city, and it's okay to be in a predominantly, you know, lower income area, or maybe it's not white, maybe it's in more predominantly African American or Hispanic and whatever. And so, I think it's good to multiply in those communities to reach different communities, because they're not all going to be like us, you know. And it's okay to reach out into communities. And some people, you know, some churches are different in this regard or that regard, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that Christ Church is multifaceted, and I think that there's different people and different leanings toward different things, and we're all biblical and all that. But the reality is, some churches like to sing a lot. Some churches like to just open up the Word, and you know, that's great. And some churches are a little bit more charismatic in how they present things. Others, it's, you know, you barely get an amen. It's all are okay. It's okay. And because of that, I think that you have to plant churches, a lot of different churches, to reach a lot of different people that lean certain ways. I mean, even at our church sometimes, it's like I'm preaching and I'm like, it's totally different than some environments I've been in the past, where they're real excited, but they surely don't show it sometimes.
Yeah.
Like you barely get an amen. And when you do get
Yeah.
an amen, everybody looks at the person that says amen, right? It's like, what in the world's going on? They're thinking. They're thinkers. They're, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with going to a church where it just seems like, okay, who's preaching here? Because everybody's talking. Everybody's amening. Everybody's and I think that all of that is okay. And I think church planting allows us to reach an entire city, because we don't want a bunch of aspires. We want the body of Christ, and the body of Christ is big. And when you plant, it just reaches so many different people, and it's exciting. So, yeah,
So,
I think
so you're saying that's what Paul's talking about when he's saying not building on another man's foundation. He's talking about the diversity within the church.
I think it's talking about the diversity within the church, and I think it's also the leadership, right? The leadership. It's not just based upon one leader.
Right.
There's only certain numbers of people in the world that can literally pastor mega churches. The truth be said, when you go and you talk to a mega church pastor, you know almost immediately, you know, if you ask the right kind of questions, whether they are the kind of pastor that can pastor that church and disciple those people, like, you know it. And it's not a large church versus small church mentality. There are some mega church pastors that they do a better job at discipling than some smaller church pastors, right? But the bullseye, going back to 2 weeks ago, it's about making disciples. And that's the bullseye. If you can make disciples and be a large church pastor, that's awesome. But if you can't, you better plant a lot of churches.
Yeah.
I found I am not a mega church pastor. I can pastor on a mega church staff, but I am not a mega church pastor. I know guys that can do it, and they can do it well, and I'm not that. But what I can do is I can plant a lot of churches. And because I can do that, that's my effectiveness. And I think there's a lot of small church pastors that may be listening today. You can do more in a city by planting churches than you can by being the mega church pastor. You're never going to be a mega church pastor, so get over yourself. You're not going to be a mega church pastor. It's okay to wake up on a morning and say, I am not going to have a large church. And that does not mean you're a failure.
Yeah.
It could be that God has positioned you to plant a lot of churches. Is it more effective to have a church of 3,000, or is it more effective to plant 30 to 40 churches in your lifetime in the city and see 30 to 35,000 people reached? What's more effective on a Sunday morning? We did this at Northwood Church in Texas, and we did the numbers, and we literally on a Sunday morning, I think we had 3,000 on a Sunday on Easter, but we counted 35,000 in attendance in all the church plants.
Nice.
So what's more effective? And 35,000 with all those leaders making disciples is much more effective in the kingdom of God than having a castle of 3,000.
Sure.
That's good.
That
you
is
know?
really good.
So
yeah.
at the end of the day, what's your goal? Having a lot of people listen to you preach, or is your goal to see people discipled in your city? And you got to come to terms with that.
Right.
But I think that you have to also come to terms in a personal way, and it comes back to the pastor, I think, and the elders of the church. You have to get over yourself and realize, I am not that. There are very, very few effective megachurch pastors in our country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not, some people are going to be gifted with obviously different gifts that God's given to lead large groups, small groups, but no matter what, we're all called to multiply as a church. We're called, as a church body, multiply more churches.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. Even a church of, 85-year-olds, 80-year-olds, and they're sitting around and they're like, how can we be a part of church planting? There are some churches that are running 10, 15 people, and their season in that building is over. And I have seen churches in that scenario say, you know what God's calling us to do? Be a part of church planting. We're going to step aside. We're going to allow a young church to come in and use this facility that's paid for, and we're going to be a part of church planting that way. Any church can be a part of church planting.
Yeah.
Sure. So then let's talk about that. How do you do this? How do you actually multiply churches?
I think it starts with God, because he builds the church. So he is the one that raises up the leader or leaders to do that. And I think it starts with the church, God and the church. So you have God, and you have a church that literally is saying, okay, we are ready to birth a church. And a church comes down to a leader too. So I think there has to be a leader. So there's God and a leader that's hearing the voice of God. And that could be a lot of different ways. I think some churches may have somebody that in their church by birth that they can plant. So it's like a by birth. So by birth, fostering or adopting. It's an organic thing, right? So how do you have a baby? Some people have them by birth, some people adopt, some people foster. And I think the same thing's true with planting. You may have somebody in your church that you've raised up. They accepted Christ when they were 6, and now they are 25, 30 years old, and they're leading, and the church wants to plant. God has spoken to that church, and you have somebody that you can raise up to do by birth. Sometimes it's adopted. Sometimes somebody wants to plant, and they tell their pastor that they want to plant, and they may get fired for that. And I've heard that many times.
Yeah.
Youth pastor comes to the pastor, God's moving in my heart. That's great. Pack up your desk.
Yeah.
You're gone.
It's an unfortunate reality.
And then you adopt that person. So maybe there's somebody out there that wants to plant in the community. The church has heard from God that they want to be a part of planting, and that church can adopt that person. Maybe bring them in and help them, teach them, give them resources, maybe even pray for them, give them people, and let them go and to plant a church. And sometimes it's fostering. We've been a part of that at Aspire, where we did not raise up the person that is planting Doxa at U of A, but they were raised up from another church. They moved out here. They needed to be part of a community. We allowed them access to our church, even access to our people, access to funding. And so they were able to go out and they were able to plant at University of Arizona. It's by fostering, right? We're fostering them. And churches can do it in different ways, and I think that it starts with God. The church, hears God and they move forward, but it also starts with that person too. There's a lot of different other aspects that come from that, but I think you start with the person. Everything rises and falls on that leader, And I think it's important to not get too far down the road as a church too, and start thinking about the vision and the place and I see a lot of churches do this. Where they say, this is where we're going to plant. This is how it's going to look. this is what we're going to do, and then we're going to find a person that fits that. I think that if you get too far down the road, you rob that person of the opportunity to find the place and cast a vision and see what that looks like. Because if you do all of that on the back end, what you're doing is you're robbing this entrepreneur of an opportunity to be an entrepreneur. And so don't get too far down the road. And I've seen churches do that where they got like a notebook full of this is what the church is going to look like, and they don't even have a person yet. And typically church planners aren't going to sign up for that.
It doesn't sound as organic as what you were talking about. Because like you said, this whole thing is organic. It's not an organization. So
Yeah, and unfortunately, denominations also get that way. We have our dots that we put on a map, and we say this is where we need to have a church plan. I think we should have a loose vision in that regard, and say, yeah, there's a lot of people here, and there's a group here, and there's not a lot of churches here in this area. Yeah, you can put a dot there if you want, but don't get too far down the road of determining what it needs to look like. Allow the leader to hear from God himself in that. Allow this couple to dream a little bit.
Yeah.
So
when we're talking about churches being multiplied, one, it goes back to some structure. You know, there's leadership, there's people, just like we see in 1st and 2nd Timothy, things like that. So you were talking a little bit about leaders. So the topic I'm about to bring up, I guess, is maybe a little bit, can be controversial, but what is a church plant and what isn't it? Like what, if a church is growing and so then you've got your castle, kind of this idea but then that's one thought, but what if they start having multi-site versus just sending out people to run more autonomously? Because and maybe there's some other different types of and methodologies that churches have that I'm not thinking of, but the one that comes to mind as you're talking is I feel like the multi-site thing is a little bit different in its foundation, right? And I'm not trying to say right off the bat that one is better than the other, but let's maybe talk about that. Is that the same thing as multiplication? If you have multiple sites, but they're broadcasting whatever the main pastor at the main campus is doing, would you say that's different?
I think the end goal is autonomy, to allow that person to that church, I should say, really be autonomous from the mother church. Just, it's organic, right? So if my son or daughter is 30 years old and they're still coming back to me to pay for the cell bill, or I'm telling them what to do at age 28, 30, that's dysfunction. And I think that we sometimes multi-site can be very dysfunctional, where we're asking these people to go and to hear the voice of God and to move and to reach their community, yet we're telling them what to do and what to preach, and maybe even putting up a screen and having them listen to me. I mean, that's a little weird. It's like, when do we get to do this on our own? And what you find is it typically takes that the group that's out there listening to the person on the screen or whatever, or hearing their vision, they typically are longing to dream and to envision for that, but they're being told what to do. Very similar to if I was telling my son or daughter that's 30 what to do. It gets awkward, But I don't think it's bad to have a church that has a heart for planting where they do have a main campus with main administration and main finances, and they do the books for this church, and they help with the logo design, and they help them do teaching teams. And then they start and kind of help that person or that church get some grounding and then have a plan in place to where they become autonomous. I've seen that happen, and it's very healthy.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we do with our sons and daughters. We help them to get their legs underneath them. And, sometimes if you have the means, maybe help them put a down payment on a house or, get a car or whatever. But that's what you're doing. You're helping this church be successful. And I'll tell you, in the first 2 or 3 years, you need that help.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with that. I don't want people to hear and say, if you're doing a multi-site, that's wrong. And I think that if a church wants to do multi-site and that's their plan forever, I think it's okay to do multi-site forever if that's what they want to do. I think it's when we call it church planting, that's when we
I
start,
see.
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's okay to be multi-site forever if you want. That's your plan. And some churches have done multi-site. For instance, Vista, the church, Larry Osborne did this in Vista, California, where he didn't want to preach 7 or 8 times, so they just did multi-site. He preached once, and they took the VCR tape and they just played it in different areas. Their goal wasn't to plant churches. Their goal was just, let's help our pastor not kill himself.
Yeah.
That's different. And I think what we have is we have a church that did a great job of multi-site there. And then now we've done is we've called that church planting, and that's not what that's not apples to apples.
Why do you think that's important to distinguish those two things as different?
Well, I think one is based upon a common leadership structure, and there's a book out. It's not a Christian book, but the Starfish and the Spider. I think that it's a business book really, and it talks about how a starfish is different than a spider. You take the head of a spider and you kill the spider. You kill the spider. You cut a leg off a starfish, the starfish is going to grow their leg. So it's diversifying. And so when if you have a church that's multi-site, 15, 16, 18, 20, we've seen it happen. You take out the leader, you take out the church. Within a month, the church is gone.
Right.
And I don't want to name names, but you can do research. I mean, there's many churches that have, you just take out the head of that spider and the spider's dead.
Right.
And with church planting, the distinction is important because you're diverse. You continue on. Church fails. Church has a moral failure. Church has a problem in certain areas, and it dies. You're not killing out the work within the
whole
city.
Thing. Right.
So it's important to distinguish that. Like, are we
Right.
talking church plan? Or are we talking multi-site here? Don't think there's anything wrong with multi-site if that's the plan of that.
Sure.
So
sure.
I want people to hear that we're
Yeah.
talking against multi-site or against campuses that morph into church planning. I don't have a problem with that too. But even churches like the Village Church in Texas, Matt Chandler, early on, I remember having a discussion with him about church planning with the Village, and it was always his goal to reach the city, not create this huge church called the Village that does everything. No, it's always about church planning. And even recently, even their sites became autonomous because he saw a need to let go of that. He also had brain cancer. That'll change your thinking too about certain, realities of how do I control this? You can't control it. So they were always a part of church planning, but even their sites changed. Even the reality that I could be gone tomorrow.
Spider turning into a starfish.
There you
There you go.
He let go of it, and now there's different campuses, not different campuses, they're different churches now, completely autonomous with their own eldership, their own leadership, their own vision, their own direction, which I think is very healthy. So, so I think you have to determine what are you talking about here? Are we talking apples to apples?
Right. No, absolutely. And I don't know if there's any other models, but that was the only one that comes to mind. Is it could look a lot like, very similar, but let's call it what it is. Essentially,
Call it what
right?
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's, and I'm just going to say this. I don't make anybody upset or anything, but I think there's some denominations and groups that really they need to determine that. They need to determine, okay, what are we planning here? Is it a church plant, or are we talking campuses? And I think we have to be very clear about that because it has to do with what's going to be here when we're gone.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to be thinking about what is going on after we say goodbye, because we're all dying. Physically, we're all dying. Individually, we're all dying. Churches die. So we all die. All churches die. And so we have to determine, okay, how do we want to keep this going?
Yeah. I think the focus can so easily become distorted, like you were talking about with some of those satellite churches where you have the main campus and then, that pastor's message is just blasted on screens to every other satellite. And I think so easily, even if it's an unconscious manifestation of that, people see the focus as that pastor. Okay, that pastor's message is the focus of these churches. Otherwise, why isn't someone else preaching
Right,
it? It must
yeah.
be tied to, that man from the pulpit is the focus of our churches. And I think for young believers, that can be very confusing to come into a church and watch a video on a screen and now they're thinking, oh, this must be what's important. If this is what is true of all of the churches, not only the main church, but all the satellites, if this is what's consistent throughout, then that must be the focus. And I think that's a really dangerous line to toe, because then you're taking the focus away from Christ and you're putting it on a person. And that, I mean, you go down that rabbit hole and there's all kinds of issues that comes along with that. And so I like what you were saying about, you know, back to Paul and not building on another man's foundation. It's not that pastor that's the foundation, it's Christ. He's the cornerstone. He builds his church. He is the one who raises it up. And so I think we have to be really careful, even like you're saying, yeah, build your satellite churches, but be careful what you're portraying as the focus, even if it's unconsciously. I mean, I'm sure those churches aren't building satellite churches and are thinking to themselves, how can we make sure that our pastor is the focus? They're not doing that purposely or maliciously, but I think very easily that can become the focus. And I just think that's a really good point. It's a really dangerous line to toe. Yeah. So why not, you know, church plant, right? Yeah, why not build other churches and the whole, the city church thing? I mean, that's what you see in the New Testament, right? Paul's going on his missionary journeys and he's planting these churches and he's letting them do their own thing, be autonomous. He's writing them letters and he's telling them different things, right? Because they're different churches. Even though he was the one to plant them, they're all different. They have different people who make up their body. They need to hear different things. They're struggling with different things. Their culture is different from one another. Yeah, so why have a monolith of what those people are hearing when those people aren't the same? They need to hear they need to hear the foundational truths and doctrines, right? Of, you know, Christ being the Son of God, that stays. But how is it going to be effective to talk about the culture of one church that isn't experiencing the same culture? It's just not gonna hit for them. And so I think, you kind of, like you said, back to the Bible. It really is that simple, back to the basics. And like, what did they do? What did that look like? And I think sometimes we forget to do that. So you kind of just have to, always make sure your heart is in the right place and that Christ is always the center.
That reminds me a little bit of our conversation before where we were saying, you know, whether you're a large church or a small church, we're not saying either one is bad. It just means that you have to be very intentional in different ways.
Right.
And so if you're a multi-site, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you're going to have to be really intentional, because we are always going to fight deception and things that are trying to pretend to be something that they're not, right? So we're always fighting against that. We're always fighting against an enemy who's just trying to, this like sleight of hand. And so all of a sudden we think that, okay, the focus is the person on the screen, like you said. That's an easy jump. And so they're going to have to be very intentional to make sure that's not the focus. So one method is be very intentional. Another one is, well, let's find someone so that way we have our own pastor here at this site, which is more of a church plant. So there's multiple ways to do that, is what I hear you say. And none are inherently wrong. Right. But we have to let's call it what it is, so that way we know how to address it. And we know kind of what things to be careful of. So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
And it's so fun to plant churches and to watch how they do it. It's so fun to watch the differences.
I'm glad you say that, because you're planning a church. So that's good.
It's just
good
fun.
To know you're enjoying it.
It's fun to watch how churches just kind of make, even to the core of making decisions, like how they hear from God together. Obviously, we all hear from God from the Word, right?
Right.
But even sitting around a table, some people hear from God and make decisions from kind of a pastoral way, like they're pastor-led. Some churches, more of an elder-led. Some are congregational-led. Guess what? They're all right. It's okay. If you guys want to gather together with 100 people in a room and raise your hands and vote every month, go for it. If you guys want to get in a room for 3 or 4 elders and make decisions and let the church know, the church is fine. Other people, they love to do things in the community. They just feel like by doing things in the community, we hear from God and we see God work, and they make decisions that way. They just let's go do something. Let's stop sitting around, just go do something. Other people, they say, we're not going to do anything until we just sit in a room and we hear God tell us, and then we're going to move forward. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay. All those things are based upon the people that are leading that church. And God gives freedom to those groups to make the decisions and to move forward in those ways. And now there may be people listening and say, you're wrong, it has to be congregational, and other people will say it has to be elderly. The reality is I've seen God work in so many different ways in church polities, and the uniqueness of that is so beautiful. Yeah. And we get to heaven, God's going to say, yeah, She goes, you did it all right. You heard from me. At the end of the day, we're supposed to hear from God.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. So, no, however it looks on the surface, if as long as you are hearing from God, right? The foundation is the same. You have to hear from God if it's an elder team or if it's the congregation or whatever.
The congregation gets together and say, well, it seems right to us that we do this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that it's okay. And I think as long as God is exalted and moving and all that, and I think church planning allows for those different types of leadership structures. It's okay to do that. It's okay. That's me. Now, if you're listening and get your own podcast. You know, that's what I believe. I believe that it is okay. And I think that we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful about the type of models. If the church decides that they're going to be a kind of a house church model, which in some ways is what we are. We're a house church model that gathers together on Sunday. But really we all meet in houses. That's our church. And then we gather together and we celebrate on Sunday morning. And we try to do that, and we have a biblical basis for it. And you can go back and listen. We believe that that's the right way to do it. But there are other people that they're much more ministry oriented. They meet on Sunday morning, and their church has 150 different ministries, and they all do it. And they do it in community and all that, and go for it. But those are two different ways of doing church. And I think that that's why you do church planting, because by doing all these different ways, you're reaching the city, you're seeing people come to know Christ, you're making disciples, and in the end, we'll all gather together in a place called heaven where Jesus is the center, and that's the main thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and
That's good.
it's okay.
Yeah.
It's
That's
okay.
really good.
So maybe like backtracking a little bit, what would you say, you know, pastors hearing that of churches and they're saying, well, the way we do it is we don't plant churches? Because I'm kind of thinking the cynicism might creep in, or, you know, playing devil's advocate or whatever. But what would you say to, well, we're reaching our community, we're reaching our city, we are, you know, we're going abroad, we're doing missions, we have ministries, our church is growing, but we just don't do the church planting thing. How would you respond to that?
I would say, first of all, if that's their mindset, all that, I wouldn't argue the point
Sure.
with them. So go for it. But I would, if you're listening and that's your view, I would say your church is going to die. Aspire will too. We're a church planting church. We will die. All churches die. Because all churches die, but Christ doesn't and his kingdom doesn't, we must join ourselves to a kingdom vision. And the Bible teaches us, I believe, that church planting is an opportunity for us to join a kingdom vision that outlives the very church that will die.
Yeah.
We must always focus on the kingdom and not the church. And if you aren't planting, what happens is church creeps in and takes over where the kingdom should be.
Yeah,
so
that's good.
don't allow the church to creep in and take over a kingdom vision. When you plant, it's always about the kingdom, because you're constantly letting go. You're constantly letting go of people. You're constantly letting go of resources. You're constantly letting go of your vision. You're letting go so that you can be a part of a kingdom vision. So I think that if it's focused on you and your church, it's not long before your church dies.
Yeah.
Your church will get older. Your church will keep getting older. That building will continue to look more and more empty. And those people get older and older, and the nursery or the preschool, whatever you call it, gets more and more empty, and then it dies.
Yeah.
But if you're part of church planting, I found that not only does your vision continue to grow with the church plants, but also the church that's doing the planting continues to have life. When we planted a college-age church and we saw 30 people leave our auditorium on a Sunday, the next Sunday we had 5 new families.
Yeah.
And our church has grown since we planted, but also it's gotten younger. So here we are planting a college-age church, and we got younger.
Yeah.
Now, how does that happen? It's the same thing when you give and you tithe.
Yeah.
How in the world does God take care of me? Well, I don't know. I can't figure out tithing. But I know that when I'm doing it, I got plenty of money. And when I don't do it, I don't have any money.
Yeah.
And everything breaks down, and God doesn't take care of me. I don't know. It's called faith. It's letting go of something. And so when you are planting, it is a way of tithing where you let go and you give. And I don't know. I don't know how it is, but typically when you plant two, you lose your biggest givers. I'll just tell you that you lose your biggest givers, and then God takes care of you. And you lose your biggest prayers, and God takes care of you. He brings other people, and He loses your biggest servers, and God brings people.
Yeah.
But if you don't do it, you're probably going to lose them anyways.
Yeah. That's good.
You're going to lose them anyways. I've been a part of churches that say we're done church planting, and you typically will then lose those people. And guess what those people will do? They're going to go plant whether or not you're a part of it.
Right.
It just happens.
Yeah. That's good. I love that. That's so cool. And I think too, I think that can be hard for church leaders to be like, but I don't want my people to leave. I don't want this gifted person that's making an impact in our church to leave and go do their own thing. It kind of goes back to the control element of like, we want to hold that close, and we want, our picture perfect church and leaders and messages and everything. And it's like, that's not how we're called to live. We're called to live with open hands. That means all that we have, the people that the Lord has entrusted into our body, we don't force them to stay. We hold them with open hands and say, you do what the Lord has called you to do. And if that's to plant a church, then I will support you in that, which I just think, such a beautiful picture of the body and the way that Christ multiplies his church. So that's cool.
It is. It's so cool. And to let go is so kingdom. And I look at some of the guys now that years ago, I'm 57, so years ago when we did our first church plant in 99, it wasn't that popular to do church planting. Even before that, it was really not popular. I mean, I think Rick Warren said the only people doing it were people that couldn't, it felt like, church planters are like people that couldn't really hack it, in the real church world. So you had to go plant your own. So, and that was in the late 70s. But in the 90s, it wasn't much different. But now it's kind of popular to plant churches and to do it. But,
which is still very loose, right? You were talking about like 95% of churches that aren't.
They don't do it. 95% of the churches really don't do it. They're not part of planting. They may give to their denomination, and they may consider that church planting. And I think it is important. But I think it's important also to literally be a part of sending members, sending your teams, sending experience. These are things that small churches can do. A small church can make a huge difference by being a part of it. We have a group here in Tucson, and I think they're doing it in Vegas as well, where you actually have a city residency where pastors get together and we plant churches together, because it would be too much for just maybe one church to do it. So we are all gathering together to do it together, to pull the resources and our money and our experiences. Somebody may be really good at administration. Other people may be really good at next steps on hospitality. Other people may be really good at how they use their facilities, or how do they mobilize the church, setting up and tearing down. And we pull those resources together to help church planners and to know that you're part of a city team. So we're doing it together, which is fun because it allows us all to work together. And this church planner may be speaking at our different churches on a Sunday morning, which is important. We may be even sharing some of our equipment. Most churches that are 3 years plus, they have closets full of crap. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And I don't know who said it. I heard it the other day. It was so, a church is dying when you just have a lot of crap.
Yeah.
Like if you are gathering a bunch of stuff that's not being used, that's the first step to dying.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
We were talking about it this week.
Warehouse.
We got to keep our stuff up for 2 weeks in a row.
That was awesome.
In our school, because they had like a break, and it was like, within a week, we had trash everywhere. You multiply that to years. Well, you know what? You can clear out those closets full of stuff, and that stuff is helpful to a church plant.
Yeah.
Chairs, your fourth sound system that you have, or third sound system board, or the microphones, the Shure 57 microphones you haven't used since 95. You can give those to church planners, and it can be a useful gift to them. So pulling those resources together and doing this together, what God does is he looks at that and he goes, wow, my family is working together. So he loves to see our small group loving one another. He loves to see our church loving one another. But boy, when you take it to a new level and you have churches loving one another in the city, he looks at it and goes, oh, my kids are playing together. It's
That's so
fun.
cool.
That's exciting. And guess what? When our church does die, which it will happen, we will look back and go, wow, 30 churches were planted. 40 churches were planted in that city, and they continue to go, and the kingdom continues to go. Well, what happened to Aspire? It doesn't matter.
Right.
Because Aspire isn't the cornerstone
Right.
of Tucson. Jesus is. You know, that's exciting to me.
That is really exciting.
It
You
is.
know, it's okay to die. What's not okay is to just exist.
Right.
It's okay to die. But to exist and try to, you know, just somehow make it another day with 10 to 12 people sitting around in a auditorium full, you know, with 1,000 chairs, that's a problem. And there are more churches like that than not. 1,000 seats, 500 seats, 40 people sitting on the front row. That is such a lonely existence.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, on one hand, it's super exciting to really just hear about multiplication. It's fun, it's exciting, like you said, and it's also really scary though. On the other hand, right? Like it's like you're giving up some of your best. You know, maybe not having all of the resources all of the time, giving away some of those resources. But I think we, as Jesus followers, anytime that we're faced with the decision to like really truly test our faith, we want to believe that God will really provide, like He says He will. So we want that, but it doesn't mean it's not scary. You know, it's a scary thing in our own lives as well as
Giving stuff away is hard.
it is,
It is.
and
It is
living with
hard.
that open hand.
You know, tithing, you know, was a struggle for me at a time, you know, and then you up it, right? You realize, oh, wait, 20%, that's crazy. And then you do it. And you're like, well, God, there are business leaders and other leaders, I don't say business leaders, but a lot of people out there that actually tithe 90% of their income and they live on 10%. Many people. And guess what? Those people are the most on fire people in the kingdom of God. Business leaders now that are 90% of what they bring in, they're giving away to the kingdom.
That's pretty bold. Yeah.
It is.
There are people in our churches that far exceed the faith of the pastors, the pastor of that church.
So what would you say to
The giveaway.
someone
It's incredible.
who is maybe feeling, I don't know if discouraged is the right word, but you're going through this, you're making decisions, you're trying to live that open-handed mentality of giving your resources and your people, but just feeling a little bit discouraged. Any as we kind of wrap up this episode, any words of encouragement to someone listening and trying to think through that and wanting to take that step of faith?
To plant?
To plant, to be open with the resources, maybe for other churches that are planting, help people.
You know, I don't know why, but just because of this podcast and kind of where we lead, it comes back to that tithing. I don't know why, but I think some pastors out there are kind of struggling like you used to struggle maybe with individual tithing, and you're thinking about your church. I think that what you do, and when somebody in your church is struggling in that area and you're sitting down maybe with coffee talking to them about it, I think the same thing's true for you as it relates to planting. I think you start somewhere. I don't tell somebody give 10%.
If
right
they're
up
not
front.
giving anything.
Nothing.
Right.
I say start somewhere. You know, if you've never planted, maybe begin to pray for that 8-year-old that you baptized on Sunday and pray that maybe God would work in their life in such a way that they are a church planter in 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Start with giving $50 to a local church plant in your community. Just start writing a check of $50 and maybe, you know, one less tablecloth at your church or whatever. You got $50 somewhere that you're spending on something. Maybe you put flowers in the front on Sunday mornings, and maybe you go to your church and say, guys, instead of doing the $75 floral arrangement in front of the podium, we're going to go ahead and give that money to a church plant. And maybe you replace those flowers with a picture of a church planter that you supported that week. And you, instead of the flowers, you're doing that. Instead of the whatever, you're doing that. Maybe you're spending $30,000 on lighting in your budget that year, or that. Maybe you just say, guys, we're going to cut the lighting a little bit this next year. We're going to give to church planting. Start making sacrifices, but also start acknowledging what you're doing with a generosity thought every Sunday to allow people to see where the money is going and celebrating church planting. Even if it's $50, just do it and watch what God does. Start somewhere.
That's good.
That's what I would
really
say.
good. Cool. Well, thank you both for the conversation today, and let's continue the conversation in
Awesome.
the future. Thank you,
Yeah.
guys.